Hey guys, welcome back. This is our last lesson on the Great Depression and the New Deal. And the New Deal is a big topic. Today we're going to take a bit of a crash course on the major programs which came out of this time period. And we're going to look at how they still impact your lives today. So I hope you enjoyed this. This video is not super long. It does have a lot of content in it. You're going to be taking some notes on the graphic organizer, and we will see you at the end. Okay guys, the first thing we're going to look at is aid to the poor. And you'll recall that prior to the Great Depression, many Americans believed that it was not the government's job to provide aid to those who were struggling. President Hoover said people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, practice rugged individualism. But that changed with FDR's presidency. FDR recognized that many people were struggling so much during the Great Depression that the government needed to do something. So the Federal Emergency Relief Act was passed in 1933 during the 100 Days. This law provided $500 million to state and local relief agencies. And the New Deal is also credited with starting the first food stamp program. It provided aid to people who were unemployed. So these programs were new in American history, and they have evolved over time. Many of these types of programs are still with us today. Section 8 housing, food stamps, unemployment compensation, etc. And we've talked about how the government right now has invested $2 trillion to support Americans who've lost income during the pandemic. So the spirit of this continues today, and the government's attempts to alleviate some of the worst effects of poverty and unemployment. The second program we're going to look at is something you've probably heard of. It's called Social Security. And whenever I ask MBA students about what the heck is Social Security, I usually get a lot of answers which have something to do with the government is tracking us, or it has to do with the Illuminati, or something to do with aliens. In reality, Social Security is a lot more boring than that. It's actually a retirement program for people over the age of 65. And the way it works is like this. If you have a job, you may have taken a moment to look at your paycheck, and you'll notice that the federal government is taking your money. Some of the money they're taking is going for taxes, but some of it is also going to this thing called Social Security. And the reason they're doing this is the government wants you to save for your own retirement. And they don't trust you to do it on your own. What they're doing is they're taking your money and they're keeping it in a special box locked away. And when you turn 65 years old, you are going to get that money back. Now, why don't they just let you do this on your own? Well, think about it. Let's say you had $200 right now to buy either sneakers and video games or to put it away in your retirement savings for when you turn 65. I think many of you would probably choose the former option, and this is why the government doesn't trust people to do this on their own. The other question is, why are they so worried about this? Who cares if you have money when you're 65? Well, during the Great Depression, many elderly people without financial means struggled. It can be a real struggle if you're old and you don't have any savings. So this is the government's way of providing what we call a social safety net to protect people in old age. Now, the other thing to know about Social Security is that this is a huge program. It comprises about 1/3 of all the government spending. The other important thing about Social Security is that this system is in some ways threatened by the fact that many people right now are retiring at the same time. They're called the baby boomer generation, and they're living longer and longer due to advances in medical technology. And so the government has to pay out more and more money. So this is putting a strain on the Social Security system. There's a real debate about how much of a strain that is and how worried we should be about it, but this is an issue that's very important these days. The third aspect of the New Deal we're going to take a look at is government work programs. One thing FDR is famous for is putting Americans back to work, doing all kinds of things as a way to get money in people's pockets and stimulate the economy. People were put to work building bridges, such as the Triborough Bridge in New York, tunnels like the Lincoln Tunnel, hospitals, libraries, roads, public housing, playgrounds, swimming pools, and many other things. One of the most popular New Deal work programs was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a program that put young men to work in the outdoors doing conservation work, such as forest protection and building picnic grounds. There was a program called the National Youth Administration that put boys and girls to work in a variety of fields, giving them work experience and providing financial assistance to help them get a college education. One of the most famous New Deal programs was called the Tennessee Valley Authority. In the Tennessee River Valley, this was a rural area where a lot of people didn't have electricity, and so they put people to work building power lines and generating electricity for these folks. A similar program was called the Hoover Dam, which is still supplying electricity to California residents today. And last but not least, the New Deal put artists to work, taking photographs, painting murals. Here's two very famous works by the Federal Art Project. You might recognize them. Some of the murals as you walk into the Bayard Rustin building, and those lovely stained glass windows as you walk up the stairs to MBA. These were all New Deal projects. And you can see on the inscription there that this was part of the WPA. Now, one thing about these programs is that we still do them today. In fact, in 2009, during the Great Recession, not the Great Depression, President Obama put many people to work doing road repair and construction as a way to stimulate the economy. Some people would like to see President Trump do more of this. He talked about doing massive infrastructure projects and hasn't followed through on a lot of that, such as building a rail tunnel connecting New York and New Jersey. It hasn't happened. But these are still projects that the government uses today to stimulate the economy. All right, the fourth aspect of the New Deal we're going to take a look at is called the FDIC. And we're going to look at this by starting with an example. Let's say we have an MBA student. Let's call him Peter. Peter is super responsible, always doing the right thing. He has a job at Duane Reade. He's saving up all his money for college. But here's the question, where should he keep his money? He should probably not keep it under a pillow at home. That's not always the safest place to keep your savings. Peter says, well, obviously I'm going to put my money in a bank. But you might remember that during the Great Depression, 11,000 banks went out of business. They collapsed and they took with them all of their customers' savings. So what would happen to Peter's money if his bank went out of business? Well, during the presidency of FDR, the government created an agency called the FDIC. It stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And the job of the FDIC is to insure your money. So let's say Peter's bank did go out of business. The government would immediately mail him a check for however much the amount of money was that he had saved in that bank. And this actually happened to some people in 2009. Some banks went out of business, like Washington Mutual. The government stepped up and insured their money. Now, why would the government do this? Why do they care if your money is protected? The reason is that banks are really, really important to the way our economy functions, and the government wants you to keep your money in the bank. The bank is going to take your money and lend it out to businesses, and people want to buy homes. This is what keeps the economy running. But if nobody trusts banks, we have a big problem. So the FDIC is there to make sure that you trust your bank, you'll keep your money in the bank, and the government is going to insure it for you. Now, the fifth part of the New Deal we're going to take a look at is something called the SEC. A lot of you Manhattan Business Academy students are interested in the stock market, and people can make money in the stock market. But you'll also recall in 1929, there was a huge stock market crash. And so the government quickly started looking at ways to make trading stocks safer for the average person. And they created an agency called the SEC. The SEC stands for Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, you'll recall that one reason the stock market crashed was that many people were buying stocks on margin, which means with borrowed money, and people were buying stocks that were way overvalued, and it was unclear in many cases what the true value of the stocks should have been. So what the SEC does is it tries to stabilize the stock market. One way it does this is by regulating the practice of buying on margin. So buying on margin is still technically legal, but there are limits based on how you can do it. Now you have to have a certain amount of capital on hand in order to purchase stock. The other thing it does is that companies that are traded on the stock exchange have to publish reports quarterly and annually which show exactly how much profit they're making and how much debt they're holding. So let's say you want to purchase stocks for Apple or another publicly traded company. You can read those reports and determine, is this company actually worth investing in? So the SEC is there ideally to try to prevent another crash like the one we had in 1929. The last thing we're going to look at here is the issue of workers' rights. Now you might recall that prior to the Great Depression, during the heyday of industrialization in the United States, workers and labor unions really didn't have a lot of rights. They didn't have support from the federal government. We looked at some examples of famous labor strikes, such as the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania when the government called out troops to break up the strike. We looked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire workers who were unable to successfully improve conditions in their factory and ultimately died because of it. So there were not a lot of laws on the books protecting workers, and that included children. Child labor was still an issue by the time we get to the 1930s. There was no federal minimum wage laws. But under FDR's administration, for the first time in American history, labor unions start to have legal protection. They passed a law called the National Labor Relations Act, which declared that workers have a right to form unions and to collectively bargain. That means they can negotiate for better wages and working conditions as a union. And this is a huge milestone in the labor movement in the United States. The other important piece of legislation to come out of the New Deal is called the Fair Labor Standards Act. It established a federal minimum wage, overtime pay, like if you work more than the regular hours, your employer is required to pay you a certain amount, and child labor laws. And these laws are still in the books today. We have a federal minimum wage in this country. It's $7.25 an hour, which is, by New York standards, very low. States like New York have a higher minimum wage. But when you look at what it used to be, when children could work in mines and textile mills for very little money, this was a huge milestone, a huge step forward for the labor movement. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something along the way. When we come back here on Wednesday, we are going to be doing our first mastery checkpoint for quarter 4, and I will give you instructions on that on Wednesday. Until then, hope you guys are staying safe, and we will see you soon.